Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're embarking on a journey, a pretty challenging one actually, into the mind of Friedrich Nietzsche.
Always fascinating, never simple.
Exactly. And we're tackling a really complex, often debated aspect, his views on women. We're going to stick strictly to his words, from his big works.
Right. Thus spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, The Gay Science, Genealogy of Morality, Human, All Too Human, the core texts.
Our mission here is just to pull out what he actually said, understand it in context. No modern filters, no taking sides, just laying out his ideas.
And that's so important with Nietzsche. You absolutely have to approach him carefully, especially on this topic.
Why is that? What's the key thing to keep in mind?
Well, his style. It's not, a typical philosophical treatise. It's aphoristic, it's poetic, and often very deliberately provocative.
So not just laying out arguments ABC.
Not at all. He wasn't always presenting literal doctrines you're supposed to follow rigidly. He used irony, metaphor, exaggeration, hyperbole as philosophical tools.
Tools for what, though?
To challenge people, to make them really think, maybe react strongly, and reevaluate their own values. He even sort of warns us himself, doesn't he, in Zarathustra?
Ah, right. He says things like, but the poets lie too much, or calls himself a fool. Mere poet.
Exactly. It's like a caution sign. We have to constantly try and figure out, okay, is this straight philosophy? Is this poetry meant to evoke something? Or is he just trying to shake things up to be a provocateur?
Okay, so that's our frame. Careful navigation required. We're focusing purely on what he said, letting his complex, sometimes, unsettling ideas speak for themselves. This is for you, the learner, who wants to understand these perspectives deeply without getting lost.
We're just aiming to present the material from his texts as clearly as possible.
Right. So let's unpack this. It's going to be quite a journey.
Right.
Where should we start? Maybe with how he uses the feminine symbolically. Because it's not all critique, right? Sometimes it seems almost reverent.
That's a great place to start, actually, because it shows a dimension that contrasts sharply with some of the later, more direct comments. He often uses the feminine not to describe actual women, but as a symbol for big, abstract ideas.
And wisdom. I remember a quote about that.
Yes, exactly. From On the Genealogy of Morality. It's a thought he gives to Zarathustra. Carefree, mocking, violent. This is how wisdom wants us. She's a woman. All she ever loves is a warrior.
Okay, let's break that down. Carefree, mocking, violent. That's not how we usually think of wisdom.
Right. It's not gentle or passive. Nietzsche's wisdom isn't something you just absorb quietly. It's active, it's challenging, maybe even aggressive.
And she is a woman, so he's personifying wisdom as female.
Yes, but a particular kind of female figure. One who demands strength, struggle, a warrior. This isn't about women in general. It's about the nature of wisdom itself.
So wisdom demands a struggle, like a warrior faces a battle.
Precisely. It fits perfectly with his whole philosophy of overcoming, of conflict being necessary for growth. Wisdom isn't easy. It demands a partner who can wrestle with it, who embraces the struggle.
So the feminine here isn't weak or passive. It's this powerful, demanding force.
Exactly. It's elevated. It embodies the relentless pursuit of truth, which for Nietzsche is always a struggle.
That connects really well with Zarathustra himself, doesn't it? His whole journey is this intense wrestling with ideas, coming down from the mountain to share these difficult truths.
Absolutely. Zarathustra is that warrior figure in a sense. He's constantly battling complacency, old values, even his own followers sometimes. So this image of wisdom as a demanding woman who loves a warrior, it just underscores the intensity needed for that kind of philosophical quest.
It makes wisdom feel less like a dusty old book and more like a force of nature you have to engage with.
A dynamic force, yeah. Not a comfortable possession, but a hard-won victory.
Is there another key example of this symbolic elevation of the feminine?
Yes, definitely. Also in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Zarathustra makes this really striking declaration about having children, metaphorically speaking.
Oh, right. What does he say?
He says, "Never yet have I found the woman by whom I should like to have children, unless it be this woman whom I love, for I love thee, O eternity."
Okay, wow. So the only woman he wants children with is eternity.
Exactly. Eternity here is deeply linked to his concept of the eternal return, the idea that you have to affirm life so completely that you'd will to live it again exactly the same forever.
Which is arguably his most radical, demanding idea.
Absolutely. It's the ultimate test of life affirmation. So when he personifies eternity as this beloved woman, the only one worthy of his progeny, he's elevating the feminine to the absolute highest point in his philosophy.
His children then aren't literal kids.
His philosophical insights, his values, the affirmation of life itself, He wants these ideas to proliferate, to be born from this union with his highest ideal, which he frames as feminine.
So again, it's not about actual women, but using woman as a metaphor for the most profound philosophical vision he has.
Precisely. It highlights how he uses gendered terms as grand metaphors. Here, the feminine embodies the ultimate affirmation, the amor fati, the love of fate. The core idea is that Nietzsche uses the feminine to personify his most profound concepts, elevating woman to a symbol of ultimate affirmation.
It's really striking how he uses that biological metaphor, wanting children, for something so philosophical. It makes the eternal return feel less like a cold concept and more like a passionate desire.
It absolutely does. It imbues it with creative energy, with longing. It suggests that maybe the deepest truths aren't just found through logic, but through this kind of passionate embrace, almost an artistic creation.
Like philosophy itself needs this life-affirming, maybe even feminine in his symbolic sense, creative spark.
That seems to be the implication. A rejection of dry, sterile rationalism in favor of something more vital, more engaged with the whole of life, including desire and creation. Wisdom and eternity, personified as female, demand not just understanding, but love and creative engagement.
Okay, so we've seen the symbolic, almost idealized use of the feminine. Now let's shift gears, because Nietzsche also has these much more direct, often aphoristic statements about women, gender, power. And these can be, well, pretty uncomfortable.
Yes, this is where things get more complex and, frankly, more controversial. These are the passages that often get cited when people discuss his alleged misogyny. It's crucial to look at them closely in context.
Where should we start? Maybe with his view of truth itself. You mentioned he connects truth and the feminine.
Yes, in Beyond Good and Evil, it's a pivotal line. Supposing truth is a woman, what then? And later he implies maybe one must not use force with her.
Truth is a woman. Okay, what's he getting at there?
Well, think about the symbolic uses we just discussed. Wisdom, eternity. Now, truth. He's saying truth isn't simple. It's not something you can just conquer with brute logic or dogmatic statements.
Like you can't just force it to reveal itself.
Exactly. Like the woman in his analogy, truth is maybe elusive, subtle. It requires a delicate touch, an indirect approach, maybe even a kind of seduction.
The seduction, how so?
Nuance, patience, sensitivity, not aggressive assertion. It reveals itself to those who woo it properly, not those who try to command it. It's a deep critique of dogmatic philosophers who think they have a monopoly on truth.
So Nietzsche sees truth not as a static thing to capture, but as elusive, demanding an artful, nuanced approach, rejecting brute force.
Precisely. And it connects to his own style, doesn't it?
How do you mean?
His aphorisms, his questions, his lack of rigid systems. You could see it as his way of trying to woo the reader towards an insight rather than hitting them over the head with a conclusion.
Ah, interesting. So his method reflects this idea of truth as something subtle, not to be forced. It's a rejection of that very sort of masculine approach of conquering knowledge.
In a way, yes. It's a counterpoint to the purely rationalistic, systematic thinking he saw dominating philosophy. He values intuition, artistry, experimentation, a gay science, a joyful approach, not a grim, forceful one. The metaphor serves that purpose.
Okay, let's stay with the gay science. He has this observation about perception, distance, and women. Something about action at a distance. It sounds physicsy, but it's philosophical.
Right, actio in distance, he writes. The magic and the most powerful effect of women is, to speak the language of the philosophers, action at a distance. But that requires, first and foremost, distance.
So women's power requires distance. What does he mean by that?
He explains it. He says when men are caught up in their own noise, their projects and plans, they tend to idealize women. They see them as these silent, magical creatures whose happiness and seclusion he yearns for.
So men project their own desire for peace or escape onto women who are simply at a distance from their chaos.
That seems to be the idea. The magic isn't inherent in the women themselves necessarily, but in the male perception, fueled by distance and their own needs. It's a psychological observation about projection.
But does he leave it there as some inherent magic?
No, and this is crucial. He immediately adds a kind of reality check. He says effectively, hold on, even on the most beautiful ship, there's lots of noise, including petty noise.
Ah, so get closer, and the idealized image shatters. You hear the petty noise of everyday reality.
Exactly. The idealization breaks down upon closer inspection. So while it uses women as the example, the aphorism becomes a broader critique of any idealization based on distance. It's about human self-deception.
It's about how reality inevitably punctures our illusions when we get too close.
Precisely. Distance fosters illusion. Proximity reveals complexity, the human, all too human. So the core insight isn't really about women's magic, but about how reality shatters comforting illusions built on distance and projection.
And that applies way beyond gender then, to heroes, to ideals, maybe even our view of the past.
Absolutely. Think about his whole genealogical project. He gets up close to morality, to truth, to religion, and reveals their messy, all-too-human origins, the petty noise behind the grand facade. It's a call to face reality without illusions.
Okay, now let's get into probably the most challenging territory. Nietzsche on love, particularly sexual love, and gender dynamics. He seems to strip away all the romance.
He really does. In The Gay Science, he offers a very stark, almost brutal take. He says, sexual love reveals itself as a craving for new property.
Property, like owning someone.
Essentially, yes, he continues. The lover wants unconditional and sole possession, wants a power over her soul as unconditional as his power over her body. He wants to be the only beloved, to live and to rule in the other soul.
Wow, that's bleak. No altruism there.
None. He sees it as a raw expression of egoism, a desire for power and possession, often masked by society's romantic ideals. He calls it the wild greed and injustice of sexual love.
And he sees this not as a corruption, but as fundamental.
It seems so. He connects it to the will to power, that fundamental drive in all life, to assert itself, to grow, to dominate, to possess. Love, in this view, is just another arena for the will to power to play out.
So underneath the surface, it's about acquisition and control for him. How does he see this playing out specifically between men and women? Does he see a difference?
He does. He follows up on the property idea by outlining what he perceives as a fundamental natural opposition in the dynamic, again, in The Gay Science.
Okay, what's this opposition?
He writes, woman wants to be taken, adopted as a possession, wants to be absorbed. Consequently, she wants someone who takes, who, on the contrary, is supposed precisely to be made richer in himself through the increase in strength, happiness, and faith given him by the woman who gives herself.
So woman gives, wants to be possessed, man takes, is enriched by possessing.
That's his formulation. Woman gives herself away, man takes more. And crucially, he adds, I do not believe one can get around this natural opposition through any social contracts or with the best will to justice.
He thinks it's unchangeable, beyond society's influence.
He calls the antagonism harsh, terrible, enigmatic, and immoral, but seems to view it as inherent, natural, like nature itself, which operates beyond human morality.
That's a really challenging idea.
Yeah.
He's basically saying there's an inherent, maybe immoral power imbalance in male-female relations that social progress can't fix.
That appears to be his claim in this passage. It's rooted in his view of fundamental drives, not just social conditioning. The core insight is that Nietzsche interprets conventional sexual love as an inherent, uncomfortable power dynamic, a will to possession rooted in nature rather than society.
It's certainly a view that clashes heavily with modern sensibilities about equality in relationships.
Absolutely. It's one of the points where his 19th century perspective, combined with his unique philosophy of the will to power, leads to conclusions that are deeply problematic today.
Okay, building on that, what about women's role beyond the personal? Their intellectual capacity, their place in public life. This leads us to some of his most infamous and, frankly, offensive statements.
Yes, particularly in Beyond Good and Evil. There's a passage that's often quoted, and it's undeniably harsh. It requires careful presentation because it's so provocative.
Let's hear it then. Context is key here.
He asks rhetorically, did a woman herself ever acknowledge profundity in a woman's mind or justice in a woman's heart? He then suggests that, on the whole, woman has hitherto been most despised by woman herself and not at all by us men.
Whoa. So he's questioning women's capacity for depth and justice and saying women despise each other more than men despise them.
That's the surface claim. And it gets worse. He continues, we men desire that woman should not continue to compromise herself by enlightening us, just as it was man's care and consideration when the church decreed mulier tacit in ecclesia.
Woman be silent in church. He's framing that as care for women.
Yes. And then he brings up Napoleon silencing Madame de Staël.
Videtur isil tacit in politicis. Woman be silent in politics. Again, presenting it almost as beneficial to women.
This is incredibly patronizing, to say the least.
It is, and he concludes with his own injunction. He is a true friend of woman who calls out to women today. Mulier tacit de mulier.
Woman be silent about woman. Basically, stop talking about yourself, stop trying to enlighten us.
That's the stark message. Now, how do we interpret this? It's layered. It could be pure provocation designed to shock and challenge emerging feminist ideas.
Oh.
It could be a reflection, however biased, of the actual state of women's limited education and public roles in his time, leading him to these conclusions about their perceived lack of profundity in the spheres he valued. Or it could just be his own prejudices layer.
What about the context within the book itself? Does that shed light?
Yeah.
Well, the aphorism before this claims, "Nothing is more foreign to woman than truth. Her great art is falsehood. Her chief concern is appearance and beauty." This links his view here to his broader themes of truth versus appearance, reality versus illusion. He often associates woman with the world of appearance, which he critiques but also sees as necessary for life.
So he's potentially weaving his gender biases into his larger philosophical critique of truth and illusion,
Yeah.
making it incredibly complex to untangle.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
provocative, likely biased, possibly observational in a flawed way, and tied into his core philosophical concerns. The core insight is that Nietzsche's challenging views on women's intellect are tangled with his critique of truth versus appearance, delivered with maximum provocation.
It's definitely a passage that requires extreme caution and contextualization. Let's look at another, maybe less direct instance where he uses a female archetype. He uses the term old maid, metaphorically, right? Not just literally.
Yes, again, in Beyond Good and Evil, he uses it to critique a certain kind of academic or scholar. He says, "Compared to a true genius, the average man of learning has always something of the old maid about him."
Why an old maid? What's the connection he's making?
He clarifies, "For, like her, he is not conversant with the two principal functions of man, which, in Nietzsche's often biological or vitalist metaphors, likely means creating or producing both literally and intellectually."
So the old maid stereotype single,
Mm-hmm.
childless, becomes a symbol for intellectual sterility,
Yeah.
for someone who studies but doesn't create anything new or vital.
Precisely. It's a metaphorical jab. He's criticizing scholarship that is merely a diligent compilation, lacking the spark of genius, the power to engender new values or ideas. It's harsh, using a loaded stereotype, but the target is intellectual infertility, not necessarily actual single women.
So it fits his broader emphasis on creativity, vitality, overcoming staleness.
Exactly. It contrasts the genius who gives birth to new perspectives with the scholar who, like the old maid in his metaphor, remains barren of significant creation. The core insight is that Nietzsche uses the old maid stereotype as a metaphor for intellectual sterility, contrasting it with the creative vitality he values.
It's another example of him using a gendered image, even a negative stereotype, to make a larger philosophical point about creativity versus stagnation.
Yes. His use of these figures is rarely simple. It's almost always serving a broader argument within his philosophy, however uncomfortable the vehicle might be.
Okay, let's pull back slightly and look at the cultural context again. You mentioned the gay science title, linking to troubadours and courtly love. How does Nietzsche develop that connection?
Right, the Gaia Scienza, or Guy Saber.
Yeah.
He explicitly credits this tradition with inventing a specific kind of love. In Beyond Good and Evil, he states, "Love as a passion, it is our European specialty, must absolutely be of noble origin."
A European specialty, not universal.
Not in his view, he continues. As is well known, its invention is due to the Provençal poet cavaliers, those brilliant, ingenious men of the Guy Saber, to whom Europe owes so much and almost owes itself.
So, passionate romantic love, as we think of it, was invented by male poets in medieval France.
That's his argument. It wasn't a natural, timeless human feeling, but a cultural construct born in a specific aristocratic, male-dominated intellectual tradition.
What does that imply about love and gender?
It places the whole concept, including its gendered dynamics, within a historical framework shaped, according to him, by men. It demystifies romantic love, showing it as potentially an artifice, a product of culture, not just pure nature.
This fits his genealogical method again, doesn't it? Tracing our core values back to specific, often power-laden origins.
Perfectly. Just like he analyzes morality, he analyzes love, stripping away the assumption that it's just natural. He reveals it in the historical creation, potentially serving certain aesthetic or social functions within that noble culture. The core insight is Nietzsche deconstructs romantic love as a specific cultural invention, likely by men, challenging its universality and revealing its historical roots.
It makes you think about how much of what we consider fundamental about relationships is actually inherited culturally.
Exactly. He forces that question. What's truly fundamental and what's constructed, and who did the constructing?
And let's revisit one more really blunt remark, also from the gay science. It seems to show his disdain for, Well, for a certain kind of simplicity or naivete.
Yes, it comes up when he's talking about his own immoralist writings and how they might affect people who aren't ready for them, the innocents. He says something quite contemptuous.
What's the quote?
I can't imagine a funnier sight on earth than inspired old asses and maids who get aroused by the sweet.
Old asses and maids. Wow. That's incredibly dismissive. What's the sweet they're aroused by?
Presumably, conventional morality, simple virtues, things he sees as superficial or sentimental. He's lumping together old maids and asses as figures who are intellectually obtuse, easily excited by the conventional, and incapable of handling his deeper, more challenging, immoral ideas.
So it's not just about age or gender, but about a perceived lack of intellectual courage or depth.
Yes, it's his provocative style at its most cutting. He's expressing disdain for what he sees as intellectual and moral naivete. Anyone, male or female, who clings to comforting illusions or conventional sweetness falls into this category for him. They lack the rigor or stomach for his philosophy.
It's a sweeping dismissal of those unable or unwilling to engage with his radical revaluation of values.
Absolutely. He uses these crude caricatures, asses, old maids, to signify those stuck in herd morality, unable to appreciate or withstand the dangerous truths he wants to convey. The core insight is Nietzsche's use of these dismissive caricatures to express contempt for moral and intellectual naivete, reinforcing his call for courage to face uncomfortable truths.
It's harsh, but consistent with his view that confronting uncomfortable truths is necessary for any kind of higher development.
Exactly. For him, staying aroused by the sweet is staying stuck in mediocrity. His path demands moving beyond that.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, navigating these really complex, often contradictory statements. It's clear Nietzsche's approach to woman is anything but simple.
Definitely not. We've seen him use the feminine in so many different ways, it really forces you to engage critically.
Let's try to recap the main strands we've seen. First, there was the symbolic and idealized use.
Right, like wisdom as that active, demanding force loving a warrior, or eternity as the ultimate beloved ideal for Zarathustra, embodying the affirmation of life. Here, the feminine represents his highest concepts.
Then there was the observational and critical mode.
Yeah, like the action at a distance idea, which turned out to be more about the psychology of idealization than about women themselves. And his really stark analysis of love as possession and a natural antagonism, his take on power dynamics.
And finally, the strand that's often hardest to grapple with, the provocative and derogatory.
Absolutely. Questioning women's profundity and justice, framing silence as care, the old maid analogy for sterile scholars, and that dismissive crack about asses and old maids loving the sweet. These are sharp, challenging, and often reflective of his biases.
And throughout all this, his language. Truth is a woman, fool, mere poet. It constantly signals that we shouldn't always take him literally. He demands interpretation.
He really does. He valued challenge over clarity sometimes, it seems. He wanted to provoke thought, even if it meant being contradictory or unsettling.
So ultimately, what's the bigger picture here? When Nietzsche talks about women, what's he often really talking about?
It seems his engagement with women, whether literal or symbolic, is frequently a tool for his larger philosophical project. It's almost always connected to his critique of European morality, culture, assumptions about truth, and the workings of the will to power.
So the statements about women serve to disturb assumptions, to question norms.
Often, yes. He uses woman as a metaphor or as a focal point to critique perceived weaknesses, sometimes societal weaknesses, sometimes intellectual ones, sometimes what he saw as inherent human tendencies towards illusion or possessiveness. His target is often the human, all too human, and gender becomes one lens through which he examines it.
So for you, our listener, grappling with this, Nietzsche is all about overcoming the transvaluation of values, even if his specific words about women seem limiting or dated.
His broader philosophy pushes towards individual strength, self-creation, rising above the herd, for anyone capable of it. His critiques, however harsh they seem, are also aimed at shaking people out of complacency, forcing them to define their own values.
Which leads to a really interesting final thought, maybe a question for reflection. Given all this complexity, all these challenges, what might Nietzsche say is the individual's responsibility, any individual, regardless of gender, when faced with societal norms, with self-deception, even with those natural antagonisms he talked about?
That's a great question. Does his philosophy, despite its problematic gender specifics, ultimately offer a path for anyone to overcome limitations, whether imposed by society or, in his view, by nature itself?
Can anyone, in his framework, redefine their own strength and value in this world he saw as fundamentally immoral and demanding constant self-overcoming.
It really makes you think about the potential for universal application hidden within even his most particular and sometimes troubling observations. What does it mean to truly overcome for oneself?
A question to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. If you found this exploration valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel, Whispers of Wisdom, for more deep dives into challenging thinkers and ideas.
Indeed. Keep questioning.